The gravel crunched beneath my rental car's tires as I pulled into the familiar parking lot of Watertown's Sacred Light Chapel. 15 years had passed since I'd last seen this place, yet every detail remained burned into my memory like a brand on my soul. The white wooden building stood exactly as I remembered it, with its towering cross casting a shadow that seemed to reach for me even from a distance. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sat there, engine running, wondering if I had the courage to step out and face the ghosts of my past. The September air carried the scent of dying leaves and old memories, and I could almost hear the echoes of hymns that once filled my childhood with both comfort and terror. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing, but all I could see was my father's face the last time we spoke. He had been standing in this very parking lot, his weathered hands reaching toward me as I backed away, tears streaming down both our faces. "Catherine, please," he had whispered, but I was already running, already choosing freedom over family, already breaking both our hearts in the process. Now he was gone, and I was back, drawn by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. The funeral director's voice echoed in my mind from yesterday's phone call. "Your father specifically requested that you be notified, Miss Catherine. He left very clear instructions about that." Those words had shattered the careful walls I'd built around my past. The chapel doors opened, and I watched as familiar faces began to emerge from the afternoon service. Women in long skirts and modest blouses, their hair covered and eyes downcast, moved like shadows across the courtyard. Men in dark suits walked with the rigid posture I remembered so well, their expressions carved from stone and scripture. None of them looked toward my car, but I knew they sensed my presence the way prey senses a predator. I was the prodigal daughter who had chosen the world over the word, the lost sheep who had refused to return to the fold. In their eyes, I was worse than dead. I was damned, and my very presence here was a contamination they would have to cleanse with prayer and fasting. My phone buzzed with a text from my therapist back in Chicago. "Remember, you're doing this for closure. You don't owe them anything." Dr. Martinez had spent months preparing me for this moment, helping me understand that returning for my father's funeral wasn't about seeking forgiveness from people who would never grant it. It was about honoring the man who had loved me despite the impossible position his faith had put him in. He had been caught between his devotion to God and his love for his daughter, and that internal war had aged him decades in the span of years. I could still see the pain in his eyes during our secret phone calls, the way his voice would crack when he told me he was praying for my soul while simultaneously begging me to stay safe in the world I'd chosen. Pastor Joseph emerged from the chapel's main entrance, his tall frame commanding attention even from a distance. His silver hair gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his black suit seemed to absorb all light around him. He had been my father's closest friend, the man who had baptized me in the cold waters of Miller's Creek when I was 12, the same man who had declared me dead to the community when I refused to repent for questioning their teachings. His eyes found my car immediately, and even through the windshield, I could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on me like a physical force. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, watching me with the patience of a man who believed he held the keys to heaven and hell. The parking lot began to empty, as the congregation dispersed to their homes, their lives, their certainties. I envied them that certainty, even as I despised it. They knew exactly who they were, what they believed, where they belonged. I had traded that security for freedom, and most days I believed it was worth it. But sitting here, preparing to face my father's funeral alone, I felt the weight of that choice like stones in my chest. The isolation I'd chosen seemed suddenly overwhelming, and I wondered if there was a middle ground I'd been too young and too angry to see 15 years ago. Maybe my father had been trying to show me that middle ground in those final, desperate conversations we'd shared in secret. I turned off the engine and gripped the door handle, my knuckles white with tension. Through the chapel windows, I could see the outline of a casket surrounded by flowers, and the reality of my father's death hit me like a physical blow. He was really gone. The man who had taught me to read using Bible verses, who had held me during thunderstorms and told me God was just rearranging the furniture in heaven, who had cried when I left but never stopped loving me. He was lying in that wooden box, and I would never hear his voice again. The grief I'd been holding at bay for 3 days finally broke through my defenses, and I sobbed into my hands, my body shaking with 15 years of suppressed sorrow and regret. When I finally looked up, Pastor Joseph was walking toward my car, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the confrontation that would determine whether I could say goodbye to my father with dignity or whether I'd be turned away like the pariah they believed me to be. I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and opened the car door. The September air felt sharp against my tear-stained cheeks as I stood to face the man who had once been like a second father to me and who now looked at me as if I were a stranger carrying a contagious disease. "Hello, Pastor Joseph," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've come to pay my respects to my father." Pastor Joseph stopped 3 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the lines that 15 years had etched around his eyes, but far enough to maintain the distance that doctrine demanded. His gaze swept over me, taking in my black dress that fell just below the knee, modest by worldly standards but scandalous by theirs, and my uncovered hair that caught the afternoon light like copper wire. I could see him cataloging every detail that marked me as an outsider, every sign that I had embraced the corruption they believed waited beyond their walls. "Catherine," he said finally, my name falling from his lips like a stone into still water. "I wondered if you would come." His voice carried the same authority I remembered from childhood sermons, but there was something else there too, a weariness that spoke of battles fought and souls lost. "He was my father," I replied, lifting my chin despite the tremor in my voice. "Whatever happened between us, whatever you think of me now, that hasn't changed." The words felt strange in my mouth, formal and careful, so different from the easy conversations we'd once shared when I was a child, seeking answers to questions that had no simple solutions. I remembered sitting in his study, surrounded by theological texts and the smell of old leather, asking him why God allowed suffering if he truly loved us. Back then, he had patience for my questions, even the ones that challenged the foundations of everything we believed. Now, his eyes held only the cold certainty of a man who had chosen his side in a war between heaven and earth. "Your father was a good man," Pastor Joseph said, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture I remembered from countless sermons. "He served this community faithfully for 43 years, raised money for our missions, helped build the new sanctuary with his own hands. But he also carried a burden that I fear contributed to his early death. The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt my chest tighten with a familiar mixture of guilt and rage. Even now, even at my father's funeral, they would make me the villain in their story. I was the daughter who had broken her father's heart, the prodigal who had refused to come home, the cancer that had slowly eaten away at a good man's faith. "What burden?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. My father had never stopped loving me, never stopped hoping I would return, never stopped defending my memory to a congregation that wanted to forget I had ever existed. Those secret phone calls we'd shared over the years had been his rebellion against their doctrine of complete separation from the fallen. He had risked his standing in the community, his reputation, his very soul as they understood it, just to hear my voice and know that I was safe. The weight of that love, that impossible choice between his faith and his daughter, must have been crushing him slowly, day by day, year by year. The burden of a father's love for a child who chose darkness over light, Pastor Joseph continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a sermon. "He never stopped praying for you, never stopped hoping you would see the error of your ways and return to the fold. It consumed him, Catherine. It ate away at his peace, his joy, his very relationship with God. A man cannot serve 2 masters, and your father tried to serve both his Lord and his wayward daughter." The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep and draw blood. This was their way, to wound with Scripture, to use love itself as a weapon against those who dared to question their absolute authority. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him, not when he was using my father's death as an opportunity to deliver one final sermon about my sins. "My father loved me," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. That wasn't a burden. That was grace. That was the kind of love your God is supposed to represent, the kind that doesn't give up, doesn't turn away, doesn't demand perfection before it can be received. I saw something flicker in Pastor Joseph's eyes, a moment of uncertainty that he quickly suppressed. For just an instant, I glimpsed the man who had once encouraged my questions, who had seen potential in a young girl's searching mind. "Love without boundaries is not love at all," he replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It is enabling, it is weakness, it is the path that leads to destruction. Your father's love for you blinded him to the danger you represented to this community, to the example your rebellion set for other young people who might be tempted to follow your path." He paused, studying my face as if searching for some sign of the girl I used to be, some crack in my armor that might let his words penetrate to my heart. "You have no idea how many families have been torn apart by children who pointed to your escape as proof that there was another way to live." The weight of that accusation settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak, and for a moment I felt the old guilt rising in my throat, like bile. How many others had I influenced? How many young people had looked at my departure and decided to risk everything for a chance at freedom? Part of me wanted to apologize, to take responsibility for every broken family, every shattered faith, every parent who had lost a child to the world beyond these walls. But then I remembered the bruises on my arms from correction, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep after being told I was inherently sinful, the way they'd tried to break my spirit in the name of saving my soul. "If my leaving helped even one person escape this place," I said quietly, "then I'm glad. I'm glad they saw there was another way to live, another way to love, another way to be human." Pastor Joseph's face hardened at my words, and I saw the last traces of the man who had once cared for me disappear behind the mask of righteous authority. "You speak of escape as if this community were a prison," he said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone I remembered from sermons about hellfire and damnation. "But what you call freedom, we call bondage. What you call liberation, we call destruction. Look at yourself, Catherine. Alone, unmarried, childless at 32, living a life without purpose or meaning. Is this the freedom you chose over the love of your family and your God?" His words were calculated to wound, aimed at every insecurity I'd ever harbored about the choices I'd made. He knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, and he wielded that knowledge like a surgeon's scalpel. I felt my composure beginning to crack, the careful walls I'd built around my emotions starting to crumble under his assault. "You don't know anything about my life," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the defensiveness in my voice. The truth was that some of his accusations hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I was alone, had been for most of the 15 years since I'd left. Relationships were difficult when you carried the kind of trauma that made trust feel like a luxury you couldn't afford. I had built a successful career as a social worker, helping other people escape abusive situations. But my personal life remained a carefully guarded fortress that few people ever managed to breach. "I know enough," Pastor Joseph replied, taking a step closer. "I know that you've spent 15 years running from the truth, filling your life with worldly pursuits that can never satisfy the hunger in your soul. I know that you've rejected the one source of true peace and joy in favor of temporary pleasures that leave you empty and searching. And I know that your father died with a broken heart, wondering if he had failed you somehow, wondering if there was something more he could have done to bring you home. The cruelty of using my father's death as a weapon against me was breathtaking, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest like a stone. My father didn't die with a broken heart, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He died knowing that he had raised a daughter strong enough to think for herself, brave enough to choose her own path, and loving enough to forgive him for the things he couldn't change. Our last conversation wasn't about my sins or his failures. It was about love and forgiveness and the hope that someday people like you would learn the difference between faith and control. The lie came easily, born from the need to protect my father's memory from this man's poison. The truth was that our last conversation had been strained and painful, full of things we couldn't say and love we couldn't fully express. Pastor Joseph's eyes narrowed, and I could see him calculating his next move, searching for the words that would finally break me down and send me running back to my car in tears. "Your father left specific instructions about his funeral," he said slowly, savoring each word like a fine wine. "He wanted you to be notified of his death, wanted you to have the chance to say goodbye. But he also made it clear that you were not to participate in the service, not to speak at his memorial, not to contaminate his final testimony with your presence among the faithful." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my knees go weak. Even in death, my father had been caught between his love for me and his loyalty to this community. "He also," Pastor Joseph continued, his voice taking on a note of satisfaction, "made arrangements for you to receive certain personal items after the service. A box of photographs, some letters, a few mementos that he felt you should have. But those items come with a condition. You must leave immediately after receiving them, and you must never return to this place again. Your presence here is a disruption to the peace of this community, a reminder of rebellion and apostasy that serves no purpose except to cause pain." I could see the trap he was laying, the way he was using my father's final wishes as a leash to control my behavior, even from beyond the grave. The parking lot had emptied completely now, leaving just the two of us standing in the fading afternoon light. The chapel bells began to toll, marking the hour and calling the faithful to evening prayer. I could hear voices from inside the building, the familiar harmonies of hymns that had once brought me comfort, but now sounded like the songs of caged birds. "I want to see him," I said suddenly, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I want to say goodbye to my father, to see his face one last time. You can't deny me that. Not even your twisted version of Christianity is cruel enough to keep a daughter from her father's casket." The desperation in my voice surprised me, revealing depths of grief I hadn't known I was carrying. Pastor Joseph studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but no less firm. "The viewing ended an hour ago. The casket is closed, and it will remain closed until tomorrow's burial. Your father is at peace now, Catherine, free from the burden of loving someone who could never love him back the way he deserved. If you truly want to honor his memory, you'll take the items he left for you and disappear from our lives forever. That's the only gift you can give him now, the gift of letting him rest without the shadow of your rebellion hanging over his grave." The finality in his voice told me that this conversation was over, that no amount of pleading or arguing would change his mind. The chapel door opened behind Pastor Joseph, and I saw several members of the congregation emerge, their faces turning toward us with expressions of curiosity and disapproval. Among them was Mrs. Henderson, who had taught my Sunday school class when I was 7, and Mr. Garrett, who had helped my father build our back porch one summer when I was 10. These people had been part of my childhood, had watched me grow up, had celebrated my baptism, and mourned my departure. Now they looked at me as if I were a stranger, or worse, as if I were a disease that might spread if they got too close. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on me like a physical force, and I felt myself shrinking under their gaze. "You need to leave," Pastor Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot for all to hear. "You're not welcome here, Catherine. You made your choice 15 years ago, and that choice has consequences. Your father understood that, even if his heart sometimes made him forget. The public nature of this rejection was deliberate, designed to humiliate me and reinforce the community's boundaries. I could see some of the younger members watching with wide eyes, learning the lesson that this was what happened to those who dared to question, who chose to leave, who refused to submit to absolute authority. I was being made into an object lesson, a cautionary tale to keep others in line. "I'm not leaving without seeing him," I said, my voice carrying across the parking lot with surprising strength. "I don't care what your rules say, what your doctrine demands, or what threats you want to make. He was my father before he was your parishioner, and I have every legal right to be here." The words felt foreign in my mouth, too bold and defiant for the scared girl who had once lived in terror of these people's disapproval. But 15 years of therapy, of building a life outside their control, of learning that I was worthy of love and respect, had given me a strength I hadn't possessed when I was 17 and desperate to escape. A murmur ran through the gathered congregation, and I saw Pastor Joseph's jaw tighten with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of his flock, and especially not by someone he considered to be spiritually dead. "Your legal rights," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "end at the property line of this church. This is sacred ground, consecrated to the service of Almighty God, and I have the authority to remove anyone whose presence defiles that sanctity. You are not welcome here, and if you don't leave voluntarily, I will call the sheriff and have you removed by force." The threat hung in the air between us, and I could see him calculating whether I would back down or force him to follow through. I looked past him to the chapel, where I could see the outline of my father's casket through the windows. He was so close, just a few dozen yards away, but he might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me. The injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. The knowledge that these people who claimed to follow a God of love and forgiveness were using that same God as an excuse for cruelty and exclusion. "What would my father say if he could see you right now?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. "What would he think of you using his funeral as an opportunity to hurt his daughter one last time?" "Your father would say that love sometimes requires difficult choices," Pastor Joseph replied, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "He would say that protecting the community from corruption is more important than indulging the selfish desires of one lost soul. He would say that true love means being willing to say no, to set boundaries, to choose the greater good over personal sentiment." But even as he spoke the words, I could see that he wasn't entirely convinced by his own arguments. There was something in his expression, a shadow of doubt that suggested he knew this wasn't what my father would have wanted. The congregation began to disperse, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this confrontation. Some of them cast sympathetic glances in my direction, quickly suppressed but not entirely hidden. I realized that not everyone here agreed with Pastor Joseph's harsh stance, that there were people who remembered the girl I used to be and wondered if this level of cruelty was really necessary. Mrs. Henderson lingered near the chapel door, her hand pressed to her heart, and I could see tears in her eyes. She had loved me once, had praised my intelligence and curiosity, had told my father how proud he should be of his bright, questioning daughter. Now she was watching that same daughter being cast out like a leper. "There's something else," Pastor Joseph said suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "Something your father left for you that I wasn't supposed to mention. He hid it in the old chapel basement, behind the furnace where we used to store the Christmas decorations. He made me promise to tell you about it if you came, but only if you agreed to leave quietly and never return." The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt, and I felt my heart begin to race. My father had left me something secret, something hidden from the community's prying eyes. The fact that Pastor Joseph was telling me about it suggested that whatever it was important enough to risk his own standing in the community. "What is it?" I whispered back, my earlier defiance replaced by desperate curiosity. The old chapel basement had been my hiding place as a child, the one spot where I could escape the constant scrutiny and judgment of the adults. My father had known about my secret refuge, had sometimes brought me cookies and milk there when the pressure of being a pastor's daughter became too much to bear. If he had hidden something there for me, it meant he had been planning this moment for years, preparing for the day when I would return and need to understand something that couldn't be said while he was alive. The old chapel basement smelled exactly as I remembered: musty wood, forgotten hymnals, and the faint trace of my mother's perfume that seemed to linger in the shadows like a ghost. I had waited until midnight to return, slipping through the back door with the key Pastor Joseph had reluctantly given me, his final act of honoring my father's wishes. The basement was darker than I remembered, filled with the accumulated debris of decades of church life, but I navigated it by memory, my hands trailing along familiar walls until I found the old furnace. Behind it, just as Pastor Joseph had said, was a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, hidden so carefully that only someone who knew exactly where to look would ever find it. My father's final gift to me, his last act of rebellion against the community that had demanded he choose between his faith and his daughter. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, written in my father's careful handwriting, each one dated and addressed to me but never sent. They chronicled 15 years of his life without me, his struggles with the community's demands, his secret pride in my accomplishments that he had learned about through careful research. My dearest Catherine, the first one began. Today marks 1 year since you left, and I want you to know that not a day passes that I don't think of you and pray for your happiness. As I read through them, tears streaming down my face, I realized that my father had never stopped being proud of me, had never stopped loving me, had never stopped hoping that someday we could find a way back to each other. These letters were his true testimony, the words he could never speak aloud but needed to preserve for the day when I would need to hear them. The final letter was different, written just weeks before his death, and it contained a revelation that shattered everything I thought I knew about my childhood. Catherine, it read, there are things about your mother's death that I never told you, things the community demanded I keep secret to protect their reputation. She didn't die in a car accident as we told you. She took her own life because she couldn't bear the weight of their judgment anymore. She had begun to question their teachings, just as you did, and they made her life unbearable with their constant correction and surveillance. I should have protected her, should have left with her when she begged me to, but I was too afraid, too weak, too bound by duty to see what they were doing to the woman I loved. The words blurred through my tears as I realized that my mother had been like me, a questioner, a rebel, someone who had paid the ultimate price for daring to think for herself. I stayed because I thought I could change things from within, the letter continued. But all I did was enable their cruelty and watch as they destroyed other families the way they destroyed ours. I'm dying now, and I know I don't have much time left, but I need you to know that your leaving was the bravest thing anyone in our family ever did. You saved yourself, Catherine, and in doing so, you saved me from having to watch them break you the way they broke your mother. I'm proud of you, more proud than I ever had the courage to say while I was alive. You are everything good about both your mother and me, and nothing they ever said about you was true. The validation I had craved for 15 years poured over me like warm rain, washing away decades of guilt and self-doubt. As dawn broke through the basement windows, I carefully folded the letters and placed them back in the box, along with the photographs and mementos my father had saved. I understood now why he had hidden this gift, why it couldn't be given to me in front of the community that had destroyed my mother and tried to destroy me. This was his final act of love, his way of setting the record straight and giving me the peace I needed to move forward. I climbed the basement stairs one last time, locked the door behind me, and walked to my car without looking back. The weight of 15 years of anger and guilt had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by something I had never expected to feel again. Gratitude for a father who had loved me enough to let me go, and brave enough to tell me the truth even from beyond the grave.